Forget the romanticized movies about smooth-talking mobsters making gentlemen's agreements. The modern global narcotics trade has violently mutated far beyond simple organized crime. It has evolved into a full-scale, highly mechanized, and terrifyingly efficient paramilitary insurgency. We are analyzing massive shadow states operating within sovereign borders, commanding standing armies equipped with military-grade assault rifles, weaponized drones, and custom-built armored vehicles that directly rival conventional national militaries. This is the terrifying reality of the narco-paramilitary cartel. You're about to step into a ruthlessly optimized multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise that successfully fuses the brutal, unforgiving violence of a medieval warlord with the hyper-efficient, compartmentalized logistical supply chain of a modern Fortune 500 tech conglomerate. In this blood-soaked corporate ladder, human life is the absolute cheapest commodity. And your survival depends entirely on your immediate capacity for absolute, unflinching violence and unquestioning loyalty. You will experience the terrifying psychological transformation required to climb from a disposable street-level informant all the way up to the untouchable apex predator who dictates global chemical supply chains and buys the silence of entire governments. Your descent into the hyper-violent, heavily militarized underworld of the modern narco-state begins right now. Your terrifying initiation into this sprawling criminal empire begins at the absolute bottom of the food chain. Standing on a sweltering street corner in a deeply impoverished border town, you are officially designated as a Halcon, a falcon. You are the absolute lowest, most expendable sensory nerve ending of the massive cartel organism. You are given a cheap encrypted disposable cell phone, a heavily crackling two-way radio, and a meager, barely survivable weekly cash stipend. Your singular, incredibly dangerous objective is to act as the permanent eyes and ears of the organization. You stand completely exposed to the elements for grueling, 12-hour shifts, intensely monitoring the dusty highways and bustling intersections for any microscopic sign of rival cartel incursions or unmarked federal law enforcement vehicles. You are explicitly instructed never to engage in physical combat. You do not possess a weapon. And your life holds absolutely zero tactical value to the local commanders. You exist entirely in a perpetual state of paralyzing paranoia. If a convoy of heavily armed rival paramilitaries suddenly rolls into your designated sector and you fail to instantly transmit the vital warning code over the encrypted radio network, your own commanding officers will brutally execute you for fatal incompetence. If the heavily militarized federal police actively raid your neighborhood, you are immediately abandoned, left completely behind to face aggressive interrogation or decades in an overcrowded, violently dangerous state prison. You realize the terrifying reality. You are an easily replaceable human surveillance camera, trading your fragile mortality for the desperate illusion of financial security in a town abandoned by the legitimate economy. But the intoxicating allure of the cartel's wealth is absolute, and your raw, desperate ambition aggressively pushes you to survive the violent streets and actively seek the terrifying attention of the local enforcers. Having successfully proven your absolute obedience as a disposable street informant, you are aggressively pulled off the dusty corners and thrust directly into the high-velocity violence of the tactical enforcement wing. You are now officially a Sicario, a dedicated, highly trained paramilitary hitman. You are completely stripped of your civilian identity and heavily outfitted in dark, unmarked tactical combat gear, advanced ballistic plate carriers, and sophisticated military-grade communications headsets. Your hands, which once nervously clutched a cheap radio, are now firmly wrapped around a customized, fully automatic assault rifle equipped with high-powered optics and underbarrel grenade launchers, explicitly smuggled across the heavily fortified international border. Your daily operational reality violently shifts from passive observation to actively executing extreme, highly calculated kinetic action. You are crammed into the back of heavily modified, armored pickup trucks, aggressively patrolling the cartel's sovereign territory like an occupying foreign army. You are the blunt, devastating, physical instrument used to violently collect massive extortion payments from terrified local business owners, forcefully secure highly lucrative drug smuggling corridors, and ruthlessly eliminate any rival gang members foolish enough to encroach on your boss's heavily defended turf. You absolutely do not engage in chaotic, undisciplined street brawls. You are meticulously trained by highly paid former special operations veterans who actively defected from the legitimate national military for substantially higher tax-free cartel salaries. You expertly execute complex military-style room-clearing techniques, coordinate massive multi-vehicle highway ambushes against rival convoys, and coldly carry out high-profile, deeply psychological assassinations explicitly designed to perfectly terrorize the local civilian population into absolute, unquestioning submission. The psychological toll is immense, requiring a complete, irreversible suppression of your human empathy. You view the unspeakable violence you commit not as a moral failing, but purely as a highly efficient business transaction required to protect massive profit margins. While you have successfully become a lethal, highly respected predator within the organization, but you still follow orders, completely beholden to the men who control the massive regional economy. Your unwavering ruthlessness and absolute mastery of paramilitary violence eventually earn you a highly lucrative vertical promotion into the complex middle management structure. You are now a plaza boss, the absolute, undisputed regional commander of a highly strategic, incredibly valuable geographic territory. You are no longer just an anonymous, heavily armed trigger puller violently executing orders in the mud. You are now the sophisticated, highly calculating CEO of a massive, heavily fortified local economy. Your operational mandate expands exponentially from simply winning localized gunfights to meticulously managing a vast, multi-million-dollar logistical empire. You directly oversee the highly synchronized movement of massive quantities of refined narcotics, untraceable bulk cash, and heavy weaponry through your heavily defended sector. You possess the terrifying, unquestioned authority to actively command dozens of heavily armed Sicario cells, completely dictating the violent rhythm of the entire city. However, your most devastating, highly effective weapon is no longer the assault rifle. It is the massive, overflowing briefcase of untraceable currency. You become an absolute master of systemic, deeply corrosive political corruption. You systematically purchase the unquestioning loyalty of the entire local government apparatus, effectively placing the police chief, regional prosecuting attorneys, and the locally elected mayor directly on your tax-free payroll. The local law enforcement officers essentially function as your highly trained, publicly funded private security detail, actively escorting your massive drug shipments and willfully ignoring your violent, highly public executions. You rule your strategic plaza with the terrifying absolute authority of a brutal, medieval feudal lord, seamlessly blending devastating, highly targeted violence with massive, overwhelming financial bribery to perfectly maintain complete, uncontested control. Yet, despite your immense, terrifying regional power and massive accumulated wealth, you remain acutely aware that you are merely managing a tiny, highly volatile fraction of a much larger, incredibly complex global machine. Eyes answering directly to the terrifying warlords who command the standing armies. Having successfully dominated a strategic regional plaza and generated massive revenue streams, you are elevated to the highest, most devastating operational echelon of the entire cartel. You become a paramilitary commander, a highly feared, deeply respected warlord directly controlling a massive, private standing army. At this elite, terrifying level, you completely abandon the subtle, complex shadows of urban corruption and transition directly into the realm of overt, highly visible and devastating conventional warfare. You no longer command small, isolated teams of hitmen riding in standard pickup trucks. You directly command massive, heavily armored battalions consisting of hundreds of highly trained, heavily armed combatants. You actively deploy incredibly sophisticated custom-built armored assault vehicles, affectionately known as monstrous, entirely capable of easily withstanding heavy machine gun fire and explosive blasts. You utilize highly advanced weaponized commercial drones to drop homemade explosives directly onto rival cartel encampments and actively intercept the encrypted communication networks of the legitimate federal military. Your massive, heavily armed convoys openly travel down major national highways in broad daylight, actively projecting overwhelming, terrifying military dominance. When a highly aggressive, deeply entrenched rival cartel attempts a massive, coordinated incursion into your highly valuable territory, you do not simply fight a localized gang war. You engage in a massive, multi-day, high-intensity military conflict involving heavy sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and complex, highly coordinated infantry flanking maneuvers. You actively fight the legitimate sovereign government to a terrifying standstill, utilizing overwhelming firepower to forcefully extract captured leaders directly from heavily fortified federal prisons, or ambushing massive military patrols to establish absolute territorial supremacy. You have successfully built a terrifying, highly mechanized shadow state that possesses significantly more raw firepower, vastly superior tactical communications, and substantially higher combat morale than the underfunded, demoralized national army you routinely humiliate on the battlefield. You are a terrifying god of localized, devastating warfare, but even your massive, heavily armored army is ultimately just an aggressive, violent tool utilized to protect the complex, invisible financial architecture of the global empire. Finally, after surviving decades of relentless violence, navigating systemic corruption, and commanding heavily armed private armies, you violently eliminate your final rivals and ascend to the untouchable apex of the global organization. You are now the Kingpin, El Señor, the absolute CEO of the ultimate narco-paramilitary empire. You no longer wear heavily armored tactical gear or personally order localized violent assassinations in dusty border towns. You operate exclusively from incredibly secure, highly isolated luxury mountain compounds or heavily guarded, sprawling coastal estates surrounded entirely by an impenetrable ring of elite, highly trained private special forces. The visceral, terrifying reality of the heavily armed street-level violence is now entirely abstract to you, completely reduced to clean, easily digestible production quotas and massive, multi-billion-dollar revenue spreadsheets. Your perspective is entirely global, highly corporate, and chillingly detached. You are no longer primarily managing heavily armed street thugs. You are actively, aggressively negotiating highly complex multinational supply chain agreements with entirely legitimate, highly sophisticated, massive chemical conglomerates located in deep Asia to secure the absolutely vital, massive quantities of precursor chemicals required to continuously flood the highly lucrative Western markets with synthetic narcotics. You casually employ elite financial architects holding advanced degrees from prestigious Western universities to meticulously launder your astronomical profits directly through the complex architecture of the global financial system, silently washing your blood-stained currency through massive European banks, vast real estate portfolios, and untraceable shell corporations. You have successfully achieved the ultimate terrifying evolution of modern organized crime. You have completely transformed a brutal, violent street gang into a highly sophisticated, completely untouchable transnational corporation that effortlessly rivals the GDP of small sovereign nations. You actively hold entire sovereign governments in a terrifying, unbreakable state of permanent hostage, possessing the absolute, unquestioned capability to instantly plunge entire vast regions into catastrophic, uncontrolled violence with a single, highly encrypted digital command, or completely by the total, unwavering silence of the highest-ranking national politicians with massive, untraceable offshore bank transfers. You are the ultimate invisible modern emperor, effortlessly pulling the immense financial strings that intentionally keep the entire region chronically dependent, violently fractured, and completely subjected to your terrifying will. But as you silently survey your vast, invisible, and incredibly bloody global empire of extracted wealth, you realize a terrifying, inescapable truth that your complex spreadsheets cannot hide. This perfectly optimized, heavily armed system is inherently self-consuming. The violence required to maintain absolute control must constantly, exponentially escalate. The heavily militarized paramilitaries you created to crush your rivals will inevitably, violently turn their advanced weapons against each other the exact second you show any sign of weakness. The true terrifying shadow war of the modern narco-state is absolutely never-ending, and the concept of ultimate, peaceful retirement in this bloody industry is completely non-existent. Stay tuned, because the true, devastating cost of maintaining this massive, heavily armed global empire is about to be paid entirely in blood, and the final war will absolutely not be fought on a distant battlefield, but deeply, violently, within the completely shattered, heavily traumatized infrastructure of the nations you have systematically destroyed.